Somehow. Sorry about this.
Don't worry.
So,
Adrian, in your good hands.
Thank you, Liam. On 21st October 1919, Concetta Brincat signed off the manuscript of her first novel, Il-Familja de Valeureux, Louis Mitluf Ġewwa l-Bosk. Both this and her second novel, Is-Saħħara Nerelis, or The Sorceress Nerelis, set in the time of the Roman Emperor Nero and completed in 1922, remain unpublished. In November 2012, I was asked by Nicholas Bonello, the husband of Concetta's granddaughter Desdemona, daughter of Emma, Concetta's seventh child, to help with the publication of these two novels. Il-Familja de Valeureux is essentially a Gothic novel set in Paris in the time of the French Revolution of 1789 and the tumultuous years that followed. Like the typical historical novel, it is the story of a handful of fictional characters set against the backdrop of the historical events of the revolution. Concetta Brincat seems to know the streets and landmarks of Paris well, but to my knowledge, she never visited the city. She must have visited it virtually in the books of history, geography, and literature that one would assume she read. I would like to argue that Brincat's hitherto unknown novel contributes three important elements to the reconfiguration of the history of Maltese literature. Unlike other female characters of early Maltese fiction, Brincat's women have a voice. They are women with some character. Catherine, for example, a housewife and mother of two, who is one of the most prominent secondary characters in the novel, is said to be pronta fi risposti tagħha. She is assertive, outspoken, and never at a loss for words. On the other hand, Clotilde, the Baroness de la Mar, is a very able and fearless horse rider. And in the deer hunting scene, she appears to be the best of the lot. The narrator tells us that her sister-in-law, Hortensia de Valeureux, is also an able horse rider. This is not to say that Brincat creates heroines that are round characters, nothing of the sort. In the same grand deer hunting scene, the narrator tells us that women always decorate the scene with their presence, whether they are in a hall or in the countryside. But in this novel, there are moments when the female characters are assertive, eloquent, outspoken, brave, and decisive, both in their thoughts and words and in their actions. The novel is also interesting because Concetta Brincat is not constrained by the Semiticizing tendencies of the purist literary language of her contemporaries. Her dialogues are just as stylized, of course, but they offer an alternative to the formulae of other writers. Moreover, indoor scenes, textiles, jewelry, and furniture are described with passion and a certain detail when compared to the often bland descriptions in contemporary Gothic novels or romantic historical narratives. In her first novel, the author takes a very critical view of the French Revolution. Mencken says that revolution is the sex of politics. Like all other Maltese authors of the period, all the way till independence in 1964, Concetta Brincat has nothing to tell us about sex or about politics. But both sex and politics, in no particular order, were taboo. Maltese modernist literature was still 50 years or light years away. In terms of political upheaval or revolutionary political ideas in fiction, however, Manuel de Mec had already published a novel in 1905 that threatened to break the mold, but it was largely ignored by the literary powers that be. If she didn't know about it, if she knew about it and even read it, it was unlikely that Concetta Brincat would follow the iconoclast's example. Manuel de Mec's incomplete novel, Ivano Praskovia, tells the story of an uprising in the large city of Nizhny Novgorod in Western Russia in the mid-19th century. As Mark Montebello has comprehensively shown, it was inspired by upheavals and uprisings in Russia in the early years of the 20th century when de Mec started writing his story. Unlike de Mec, however, Brincat does not seem to have been particularly sympathetic towards revolutionaries. Not many Maltese writers were, anyway. Moreover, as Charles Schwirep and others have shown, even today, in a Malta colonized by the British, often arch rivals of the French and protected by a conservative Catholic church eager to banish all ideas that might threaten its privileged position, its privileged status. Anti-French sentiment seems to have been widespread. Not many Maltese writers shared the enthusiasm for the freedom and openness de Mec associated with France in his articles and in his novel. The protagonists and the ringleaders of the uprising in de Mec's novel, the uprising against the tyranny of the Tsar and his henchmen, escaped to France and specifically to Paris, the land of culture, literature, and above all, in the words of the novel, freedom, Lucia, he says. In Concetta Brincat's novel, the sans-culottes, she calls them sans-culotti. You can see it at the bottom of the picture of the manuscript, which suggests, of course, that she is taking her source is Italian, is written in Italian. The sans-culottes are portrayed as uneducated thieves, murderers, and opportunists. Her ideological position is set out clearly in the first two sentences of the prologue, in which she writes about the terrible confusion, التحويل terribly, in France in 1789, that came to be known as the reign of terror and blood, and I'm quoting. Again, another quote, thousands upon thousands of people, writes Brincat in the second sentence of her prologue, lost their lives as victims of the ambition and hatred of the lower classes against the nobles and priests, and that too is a quote. Using an analogy that anticipates the setting and one of the themes of her second novel, completed 3 years later, there was so much cruelty, writes the author in the French Revolution, that it could be compared to the persecution of the Christians in the time of the cruel emperor Nero. During the revolution, writes Brincat, beautiful France was under the rule of the kind-hearted King Louis XVI, who was married to Princess Marie Antoinette of Austria. The prologue tells us that the king, who is once again almost obsessively described as toyer, kind-hearted, gave the people whatever they asked of him. But he did this against the will of the nobles, who were, quote, very arrogant and proud, superbi, gburin al-akhar. The lower classes in Popul Bash, who were sick and tired of the contempt and arrogance, is zeblihu superbi of the nobles, revolted and asked for new privileges, but the king refused to give in to their demands. Thus, Paris, and here I quote again, Paris, the shining example of elegance and nobility, Brincat continues to say in her prologue, became the city of fear and horror. In the novel, the implied author is not only clearly against the way order is being upset by the sans-culottes, but she is also very upset by the indiscriminate killing, the thefts, the targeting of the Catholic Church, the priests and the nuns, and by the rude and uncultured behavior of a poor and uneducated mob. Although the novel acknowledges the arrogance of many nobles, it argues that this could never justify the indiscriminate violence that was meted out to them. and to a largely kind and likable royal family. Although the heterodiegetic narratorial voice of Brincat's novel understands the common people's anger and thirst for revenge, it cannot but condemn their unbridled violence. This is immediately apparent in the first scene of the collective violence, the first scene of collective violence in part 2 of the novel, when the sans-culottes ransack the palace of the Delamar family, kill the servants of the nobles, and are only stopped from gang raping the exotically beautiful Baroness Clotilde Delamar by Michiel, one of their more enlightened leaders. Clotilde is the sister-in-law of one of the protagonists of the novel, Edouard, Baron de Valeureux, father of the Louis mentioned in the title. Clotilde is the daughter of the French governor of Martinique, which is mentioned 8 times. Martinique is mentioned 8 times in the novel. Hortensia, Baroness de Valeureux, describes her as so graceful and beautiful, like a rare gem. I have never seen such beauty, says her sister-in-law. A true Creole, one of those people mentioned. One of those people mentioned. This Orientalist streak is worth deconstructing, of course, but this is not the subject of my talk. One cannot ignore the fact that Concetta Brincat wrote her first novel at a time of great economic, social, and political strife in post-war Malta. She finished her novel in October 1919, that's 4 months after the tragic events of the 7 Junior riots that eventually led to the colonized Maltese gaining an unprecedented degree of self-rule, or autonomy, as they often called it at the time, from the British colonizers. We don't know when she started writing her novel, but anyway, I doubt that the events in the streets of Valletta, Hamrun, and elsewhere would have changed the character or direction of her literary project. From what her novel says about the French Revolution, I doubt whether Concetta Brincat would have approved of the violent nature of elements of the popular protest that essentially brought together the Maltese nationalists of various shades and the socially engaged dockyard workers who were involved in the protests. It may come as a surprise to many that Maltese literature hasn't had much to say about the 7 Junior uprising. So what seems to have been Concetta's silence about the events was absolutely the norm rather than the exception. I'm sure that as a humanist, she would have been shocked by the news of the many fatalities and wounded. But these tragic events did not usher in a wave of literary works about what happened. I think it is fair to say that Concetta Brincat was fascinated by France and particularly by Paris. This might be because of the French education she received as a child, which might also have been the cause of her interest in the Roman Empire, which elements in the French colonial project sought to emulate. Born in Birkirkara in 1870, Concetta Xiberras spent most of her childhood in the city of Constantine in the mountains close to the Tunisian border of French colonial Algeria, which was mentioned, of course, in the previous talks. She crossed the Mediterranean on board the steamship Lansfield at the age of 4 with her mother Giusa, her 2 brothers Spiridione, who appears in this photo, whose passport allowed them to travel, and Salvatore, and her sister Carmena, who would die in Constantine at the age of 17 in 1884. Spiridione Xiberras was actually the first member of the family to go to Constantine in 1872 and probably stayed with the family of his maternal uncle, Vincent Joseph Borch. Spiridione's father then joined him in late 1874. Spiridione returned to Malta briefly in the spring of 1875 to accompany the rest of his family in their journey, on their journey to North Africa. Details of these journeys are available in the registers of the Customs Department at the National Archives of Malta and Santo Spirito. And French National Archives provide us with information about the main life events of the Xiberas family that lived in the so-called Arab quarter of Constantine. But I have found no mention of Concetta in Constantine itself. She is mentioned by name as a passenger on board the steamship that ferried her to North Africa in 75, and on the steamship that ferried her back to Malta at the age of 14 in 1885. But otherwise, I have no documents related to her stay in Constantine. In her family, it is said that she obtained the prestigious Certificat d'études primaires. If that were true, and I have no reason to doubt the veracity of this quite particular piece of information, it would have been a great achievement indeed at the time. Her two brothers were small merchants who seem to have done relatively well in life and never returned to Malta for good. But their lives were marked by the deaths of their children. Out of 9 children, the two of them had together, only 2 survived, a son of Spiridione and a daughter of Salvatore, who eventually married each other after obtaining dispensation from the Catholic Church. Concetta Xiberas returned to Malta with an education that many of her compatriots in Malta would have only dreamt of. Education was certainly important to her, and as confirmed by the school registers of Birkirkara and Slema, again at the National Archives, at the beginning of the 20th century, she and her husband Vincenzo Mastrucens made it a point to give their children an education. Concetta Brincat's 2 novels leave me with a number of unanswered, very important unanswered questions about whether they are translations or adaptations, as most popular novels in Malta at the time were, as Joseph Brincat and others have shown, or whether these are original works by Brincat, by Concetta Brincat, of course, inspired by books she read in Italian, English, and possibly, but not probably, I would say, in French. I doubt that Il-Familja de Valeureux is a translation of an existing novel. This is definitely not a word-for-word translation. I say this, first of all, because there are a number of spelling mistakes in the names of places, including the name de Valeureux, some of which are consistent throughout the novel. But there are other important indications. Some names in the manuscript were changed by someone who revised the text, and a close examination of the handwriting suggests that it was the author herself who made these changes. For example, Lucy, the daughter of Pietro, was originally called Edith, and in chapter 5 of the second part of the novel, the chaplain of the Church of Sulpice is first called Dom Bastian and then corrected to Dom Ambroge. Another important intervention that suggests that the author had at least an important say in the writing of the novel is the fact that a paragraph at the end of chapter 1, part 1, chapter 2, after a mention of the attack on the prison of La Bastille on 14th July, of course, was crossed out by the author. A shorter version of this text appears a bit later in the first part of the next chapter. And there I'm reproducing the 2 different texts. I've gone into a lot of detail in other parts of this paper, which of course I cannot reproduce here because of time constraints. There are indications, for example, in the way she describes, as I mentioned earlier, what people are wearing or what kind of furniture there is in the room, that both her novels were what I would call a labor of love. The fact that she created a pen name, Cornelia Melitese, which you can see over there on screen, when she wrote her first novel in 1919, and she continued to use it when she wrote her second novel in 1922, indicates that she did want her work to be seen as a respectable work of literature and published. That pen name is a proud statement of identity, I will argue. while Maltese is probably an incorrect rendition of Maltese in Latin, as my colleague Carm Saracino has pointed out, the first name Cornelia echoes that of the famous Roman mother of the Gracchi. Of course, we know that she was interested in the history of the Roman Empire from her second novel. Her second novel is set, after all, in Roman times. Okay. In her 2007 book on Cornelia, Mother of the Gracchi, Suzanne Dixon writes about the mythical figure of Cornelia, daughter, wife, and mother of famous men, writes Dixon, who has won an enduring place in a narrative of Roman history dominated by men. It is not difficult to understand why Concetta Brincat would have wanted to identify herself with such a powerful female figure. Cornelia was revered by her sons, political successors, orators, authors, and even Roman emperors as Mother of the Gracchi. In a time of moral upheaval and cultural innovation, Cornelia's drive and dedication, which Concetta would have certainly admired and sought to emulate, equipped her sons for the new age, writes Suzanne Dixon. Cornelia, however, and this is, I think, fundamental in understanding or trying to understand Concetta Brincat's choice of Cornelia Maltese as her pen name, Cornelia was admired for her prose style, her fertility, her philosophic calm in adversity, her vicarious ambition. Concetta would have admired both her qualities as a selfless mother and Cornelia's qualities as a person who was creative with the written word, which in the case of Cornelia was evident in the letters she wrote and exemplified in her eloquence, which exemplified her eloquence. Over here, in other parts of my study, I go into what could be the influences, what Concetta Brincat could have been reading in order to write her first novel. Of course, I cannot discount the possibility, I cannot ignore the possibility that she was actually translating a work which already existed or adapting it. But I haven't come across a work which suggests such a possibility. But one of the works which might have influenced one of the writers and his works, who might have influenced Concetta Brincat was of course Alexandre Dumas, le Père, who wrote, for example, The Count of Monte Cristo. And in The Count of Monte Cristo, there's a name, which is the village of Auteuil, which is mentioned, of course, which is prominent in that novel, and which is mentioned again in Concetta's novel. And now Concetta has a very difficult relationship with spelling, and she's not only does she make mistakes, but she's also inconsistent in her mistakes. But in this case, it's clear because one of her mistakes suggests that she is actually referring to this village of Auteuil, which is close to Paris, I think in the western part of Paris, if I remember correctly. So she might have got the name of this village from The Count of Monte Cristo, which was translated by Giuseppe Cumbo into Maltese later in 1937. This is another novel, which is a sequel to the Count of Monte Cristo, written by. It's not mentioned over here, but you have the name in my next slide. this work was translated from the novel by Lermina, who wrote, and this is the Italian translation, Il-Figlio di Montecristo seguito al Conte di Montecristo. And this is probably where Giuseppe Cumbo took his cue from to write this Maltese version. This is just to give you an idea of how complex the relationship between the Maltese versions and their possible original sources is. And a lot has been written about this by Joseph Brincat, by Arnold Cassola, by a number of students in their dissertations. So I try to go through this in my longer presentation, in my longer study. Why didn't Concetta Brincat publish her own novel? Well, that's of course a different story. That's another story that would take up a whole presentation. But basically because she was a woman, and because women didn't have the same kind of opportunities that men like Giuseppe Cumbo had. Here, Giuseppe Cumbo is writer, he's translator, he's publisher, and it's most unlikely that, even though they both lived in Slema, probably at this, well, certainly at the same time, they were contemporaries. Concetta Brincat certainly wouldn't have had the opportunity of getting her work published in the same way as Cumbo would have. Okay, there you can see sort of the same format used both in the title and in the fact that there is a prologue. There's no prologue in her second novel, but in this novel there is what Cumbo's calling a prologue. It's actually not really a prologue in the Concetta Brincat sense, but it's the same word. Notice also that, like her contemporary popular novelists or Gothic novelists, Concetta Brincat is not too bothered about using words of non-Arabic origin, which is, I think, refreshing. It's clear to see the difference between a novel like this, which was, a way of making money. It was a job for somebody like Cumbo, and the labor of love, which I would argue Concetta Brincat's work is. Notice that it's all about dialogue here, it's quick exchanges, whilst Concetta Brincat, even though of course she's no Marcel Proust, but she's interested in setting the scene and in presenting characters. She may not be as brisk as somebody like Giuseppe Cumbo and the other popular novelists, which have also been mentioned today by other speakers, but there certainly is a different kind of passion, I would say, in the way she is writing and presenting her work, and that's all for me.